The Spender Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory are proud sponsors of Our American Heritage.
Good morning and welcome to Our American Heritage. I am Art Shutter, the host of the program. Our American Heritage is a program where we explore in depth the American experience from its beginning to the present. And today we want to welcome as our guest, Rob Carroll. So Rob, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Art.
It's a pleasure to have you. I usually, listeners, introduce our guests, but I would prefer this time because Rob has such a long background that he would introduce himself and explain exactly who he is and what he does.
Oh, okay. Fantastic. Well, Art, I'm a proud owner of a high school diploma, which is a great accomplishment for me, considering I really slacked off towards the end of high school. Now, to explain myself, I make fun, but I'd qualified and I'd received a music scholarship in the beginning of my senior year in high school.
Oh.
And that's what I was going to go on. I had a full scholarship, I was going to study classical clarinet. And so I really slacked off. You know, I'm not particularly proud of it, but that's the way it was. So I was called an amazing underachiever by my guidance counselor.
Welcome to my world, Rob.
Yeah. A very long story short, there wound up a problem with the college I was going to go to, and they had to rescind the full scholarship and offer me a partial grant, which I would have been the first one to go to college in my family. Nobody knew anything about grants or college, and I couldn't afford it. My parents couldn't afford it, so I went out and spent that summer working in the back of a trash truck instead of preparing for a career as a classical clarinetist. So I got a great dose of reality right there, and starting in the fall that year, I started working just working odd jobs for a living, and went through a number of different early careers. But the entire time, I kept on practicing saxophone, and eventually became a professional sax player in my mid-20s. Wow. But how all this pertains to anything else, during this entire time, I kept my other passion going, which was American history. I kept reading any American history, Western Civ, anything I can get my hands on. I always had a passion for history. Even when I was on the road as a musician, I would go to historical sites. I would read on planes. Actually, I got a great story very quickly for you. We were flying out of Atlanta, and I picked up a book on biographies of the signers of the Declaration. And I used to sit with the guitar player in the band, who was not a great reader. And I started laughing out loud. He said, "What are you laughing at?" I go, "Well, I'm reading here about James Otis, and he said that he fell under the influence of Samuel Adams." And he goes, "I don't get it." He goes, "Well, last night I almost fell under the influence of Samuel Adams." in a different way, obviously. But so in any case, I just always found that amusing. So they were my dual lives during my 20s and my 30s.
And also now being a musician, Rob, please tell our listeners what else you do. And before you answer that, I need to tell our listeners that Rob and I have touched our backgrounds, and through the past several years, we have touched several times through school and education, the Freedoms Foundation, and what Rob does in Philadelphia. So, Rob, share with our listeners, please, what else you do, as well as the full-time music career that you have.
Well, what happened was I wound up, I finally got married in my late 30s, and I stopped traveling. I was playing more and more in the Philadelphia area, and I got married kind of as settled down as I was ever going to get. So I started looking for more work to support this new family that I had, and I just happened to, I was playing in a blues band with a great blues player and a great historian in his own right, Joe Beckton. And Joe, I told Joe when he goes, "Well, I think you do really well as a tour guide." I go, "Okay, well, do I have to go to school for it?" He goes, "Nah." You got a good source of info already, and you just keep on research, you just keep on reading, and so he introduced me to one Donna Tate, who owned American Heritage Student Tours, and Donna was connected to Freedoms Foundation. So I wound up as a tour guide for Freedoms Foundation, and eventually worked with them in some graduate graduate courses. I know you were involved. You were involved in graduate courses as well, correct?
Yes, I'm one of the directors of graduate programs for them. Yes.
So, and one thing that changed my life was I was given a scholarship, meaning that they let me attend a 1-week program with Dr. Sanborn.
Oh, great.
And it was the Revolution in Mid-Atlantic States.
Mm-hmm.
And so I took that program, and then they asked me to participate along with Dr. Sanborn, and actually 2 of them they had me run myself, with overseen by a professor from Lafayette. So, and I worked in, and I know we crossed paths definitely through American Heritage.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So I became a tour guide, Philadelphia Valley Forge, Trenton, Brandywine, and just now I had a reason to buy even more books, and I could write them off on my taxes. So I wound up collecting a couple hundred books on the American Revolution, and it really got me back into my favorite guy of all time, which is Ben Franklin.
And Rob, tell our listeners, please, what makes Benjamin Franklin your favorite guy?
Oh, just a number of different reasons. One, I obviously connected with him because he had 10 years less education than I had. You know, he's a self-made, academically, in every shape of the form, he's a self-made man. You know, he runs away from Boston when he's 17. He comes to Philadelphia, he doesn't know a single person, and succeeds completely on his own. He's a lifelong reader. I think an advantage he had by not going, his father's plan for him was to matriculate to Harvard and become a minister. And after 2 years, Ben is 10 years old, and his father's kind of getting the idea that Ben is not going to make a very good minister. A little free thinking for that. So his father ends his education. I know there's a lot of stories out there that his father couldn't afford it anymore. I don't know whether that's true or not. I know that I've read enough, I've seen enough research that his father decided it wasn't going to be a very good idea. So Harvard is now out of the question. And I think if he winds up going to Harvard, he gets painted into the same classical box and the same classical thinking as everybody else in the day.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that makes him so unique is his freedom of thought. You know, just so many things about it. But that's really where it starts. Those 2 things are where it starts with my affinity for Franklin.
And Rob, with your affinity for Franklin, you are a Benjamin Franklin reenactor. Is that correct?
I like to use the word portrayer.
Portrayer, yes. Thank you. I was searching for that word, and it wasn't on my tongue.
Right. Some people refer to themselves as an impersonator. Some people call themselves a reenactor. And I don't know why. I think maybe if nothing else, I just like the sound of it, not necessarily the definition of it.
Sure.
And one thing that now I've been on stage since I was 5 years old. I started singing in church when I was 5 years old. So, and I've been acting and singing and playing music since I was 5. Well, let's start music a little bit later. I'm completely comfortable on a stage. I'm more comfortable on a stage than I am in a social situation. And so this was just a natural step for me. After 20 plus years of reading and the experience I had as a performer, I just fell into it. And what led me to it actually were 2 gentlemen. One was kind of the face of Ben Franklin, Philadelphia for a long time, Ralph Archibald.
Yes.
And I got to know Ralph because I played colonial fife. And Ralph hired me a great deal as a fifer. And I approached him one day and said that, you know, I know a great deal about Franklin, and when you retire, I wouldn't mind taking up that mantle. And he encouraged me. He goes, you know, you don't need to wait for me. There's a lot of work out there, and I'd be happy to, you know, recommend you for any work. As a matter of fact, he recommended me in 2006 to the U.S. State Department, and I went to Russia for a week.
Wow, that's cool.
Franklin. And the other gentleman who even became a more important person in my life is from right here in Newtown Square. He was right here from Newtown Square, Mr. Dean Bennett. Dean Bennett was a professional actor. He'd actually been doing Franklin when Ralph showed up in Philadelphia. He'd already been there performing the character. And I actually developed a very, very close relationship to him. He became a mentor, became a father figure to me. And I'm speaking to you from an apartment above the house where he used to live.
Mm. In Newtown Square, Rob.
In Newtown Square, yeah. So about 2 blocks from the high school.
And our listeners need to know that, you know, people that have grown up or live in Newtown Square are pretty shady characters, aren't they?
I don't know. I'm from South Jersey.
Oh, well, you're safe. You're safe then.
But they've welcomed me. So very possibly, yes.
Yes. And listeners, I am born and raised in Newtown Square. So, we have certainly welcomed Rob Carroll to Newtown Square, and we love him because of his love for American history and what he does. He's a great American. He loves his country. So, we welcome more people like Rob Carroll in Newtown Square.
And you've shaped a lot of minds here. I don't know whether that's
well,
my son being one of them. All three of my sons being.
Well, you before we go into Franklin, you share with our listeners, please, if you wouldn't mind, Andrew, because I know how proud you are of what Andrew is doing.
Well, Andrew's my youngest. He's 19. He completed basic training in Parris Island November 1st of last year. He's currently going to Ammo Tech School in Fort Lee, Virginia, and he'll be moving. He believes he'll be moving to Fort Lejeune next month. But yeah, he's on a four-year active hitch in the Marine Corps. Also, I want to share with your listeners that I surprised you one day at a wedding that you were officiating.
You sure did.
Because the wedding was for my second youngest stepson. And now, did you teach my oldest Sean as well?
Yes, I did.
I thought you taught all three. Yeah.
Yes, I did. Actually, Sean gave me a big portrait of.
That's right.
Of the Vietnam Memorial with the statue. Yes, and I still have that sitting here in my office with that picture. Yes.
Well, he bought that when I'd taken my wife and the boys down to D.C. for a couple of days.
Yeah.
And that's where he bought that. And I remember he didn't tell me he was buying it for you. He just said he was buying it for one of his teachers.
Oh, huh.
And I have to share with your listeners that you are our charter is held in very high esteem in this town for the educational work that he's done.
Well, that's very kind of you, Rob. Thank you. So let's, if you don't mind, let's go into Benjamin Franklin. And listeners, I'm going to ask Dr. Franklin some questions. So if you don't mind, so we're going to continue this in this show and then in the next show with Dr. Franklin. So if that's okay, Rob, we can do that.
Absolutely. Fire away.
Okay. We want to welcome Dr. Franklin to our show and everything that Dr. Franklin has done. So, Dr. Franklin, thank you for coming and sharing some of your life with us.
Okay. I'm going to speak in first person as Rob Carroll, if that's okay.
That's perfectly fine. Dr. Franklin, we from the Philadelphia area, we don't know a lot about your early life. Could you share some things about your life before you came to Philadelphia?
Oh, being born in Boston. Actually, I was born. I enjoyed two birthdays. Very, very little known fact. Being born in 1706, prior to the calendar change, in 1750. Everyone had 11 days added to their lives. So even though the birthday is celebrated January 17th, I was actually born January 6th. And very cold, very snowy, Christmas, Sunday morning. And being born on the Sabbath was a sign from God. And that's one of the reasons why, I guess that's one of the reasons why my father, he felt the need to rush me to the church across the street. He was actually a layman in the church and had me christened that very morning. And it also led to his decision that me, his 15th child, should be his tithe to the church, and that was the original plan for me to matriculate to Harvard and become a minister. It was interesting that I was rushed over so fast that I wasn't given a middle name, and forever I was just Benjamin Franklin. Interesting enough, my father said I was named after his very favorite brother, which I find interesting that there were 7 sons before me, but yet I was named after his very favorite brother.
Wow.
He had a brother that was a kind of an amateur poet, amateur minister. Never really took a profession when he came over. He came over with my father from England. My father was a dyer of cloth over in England, and you're not really going to have a lot of work for bright colored cloth in Boston in the late 17th century. So he learned the trade of soap and candles. I was brought in as apprentice to him, and that was going to be my life's work. I was going to make soap and candles, and I gave him such a tough time for 2 weeks, and he finally gave up on me. And he shipped me off to my brother James, who just come back from England and was running his own printing shop. So at 11 years old, I was apprenticed to my brother James. And apprenticeship at the time, as you know, is indentured servitude. You were owned by that individual. So I was now owned by my older brother. Sibling rivalries are tough enough without a contract between the two of you.
Yes.
Yeah. So we fought, we argued all the time, and unfortunately, he had the upper hand. He could raise his hand to me whenever he wished to. I started. Actually, my father bragged that I read when I was 4 years old. He taught me the Bible, and I could read a Bible when I started reading the Bible when I was 4 years old on my own. So working at a printing shop was great for me. I was next door to a bookseller, so I just took the most advantage I could from the situation. I would read everything I possibly could. I was reading grammar, composition, scientific theory, philosophy, anything I could get my hands on. I finally made enough money. I purchased my first book, which was Pilgrim's Progress. I decided early on I wanted to be a writer, so I guess I'll tell you the Silence Dogood story, which is very critical to why I wind up in Philadelphia. Try to make this as concise as possible. I decided I was going to write a character named Silence Dogood. She was a 6-year-old widowed farm woman from just outside of Boston. And here I am, a 16-year-old boy trying to take on the voice of a widowed farm woman. So we did our first letter to the editor of my brother's newspaper was going to be that women should receive the same amount of education in Boston as men, which was scandalous, absolutely scandalous. Yes. And I knew my brother would never print my article. So what I did was I snuck it at night and slid it underneath of his office door. And he came in the next morning, found it, read it, found it very amusing, had no idea who wrote it, but he didn't care. He was very impressed with the work. So he published it. I wrote another one, and this one won 17 times. Well, what happens is circulation doubled and nearly tripled because of Silence Dogood. Silence was the toast of Boston. And I got into an argument one day. I was 17, got into an argument with my brother, and I said, "You are so smart, are you? Guess who Silence Dogood is?" He became furious. Absolutely furious. And he started boxing my ears. I went home, told my father the story. My father was a very stern man. He was a loving man, but he was very stern. And I swear, for 1 second, I saw him crack a smile that his son Benjamin was Silence Dogood. But he clamped that smile down very, very quickly. So he insisted I go back to the printing shop and apologize to my brother for making him hit me. And I told my father no, which you don't tell my father no. And within a couple of days, I booked passage on a ship, and I was on my way to New York City. Could not find work in New York, but I heard about a job opening in Philadelphia. And I called Philadelphia, the literal translation of Philadelphia is brotherly love. And I've not experienced a great deal of brotherly love as of recent. I thought it'd be a wonderful place to resume, to build a new life. So I walked across New Jersey and arrived October 16th, 1723. In Philadelphia, did not know a single soul.
So let me ask you, Dr. Franklin, you walked across New Jersey to Philadelphia?
Yeah, it took me 3 days.
Wow.
Now, you look at a map and you think, oh, New Jersey's not that big. Until you start walking across it. I did make a valuable friend. My last day in New Jersey, my last night in New Jersey, I stayed at a kind of a tavern rooming house in Bordentown. And I was planning on just sleeping outside, perhaps in the stable. And I made the acquaintance of a doctor from Philadelphia who had property in Bordentown. And we got talking, and he was impressed that I was as well read as I was for my age. So what he did was he paid for my lodging that night, and paid for my dinner and my lodging that night in Bordentown. And I met up with him once or twice again in Philadelphia, and he provided me with some contacts in Philadelphia that helped me.
And Dr. Franklin, when you arrived in Philadelphia, exactly, did you have a lot of money did you have a lot of food?
Oh, no.
When you came to Philly, what happened when you got to Philadelphia?
I had a couple pennies in my pocket. I had a crate that was on a ship that was going to, once I decided to head to Philadelphia, I put my crate on a ship, and it was clearing the Cape of New Jersey. I was coming up Delaware River, and I wasn't going to see it for almost 2 weeks. I had a couple pennies in my pocket. So I had to find work that very day, which I did. I found work that very same day. I arrived in Philadelphia and I saw a woman with a baby. And well, first I went to a bakery and they had penny loaves in Boston, but they didn't have them in Philadelphia. What they had smaller loaves. You could get 3 loaves for a penny. So I paid the penny. I got the 3 loaves, and I'm juggling these 3 loaves, and it must have been very comical because I'd go to eat one and have the other 2 underneath my arm, and then one would fall down. And it was like a comedy show. And then I came across a woman with a baby, and I gave one of them to the woman, for her and her child, and made my life so much easier. But you know what? Another moment from that arrival, I go into a Quaker meeting house right in the corner of 2nd and Market, about a block from where I landed. And I went in, and there was a group of people going in. So I go in, and they had sets of benches that were all facing each other. And everybody just sat down. I sat down, and everybody was quiet. I was quiet, and nobody said anything. They just kind of just sat there, and I fell asleep. And I don't know how much time elapsed, but a gentleman tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Son, the meeting's over." And I had no idea what he was talking about. So I'm talking. The gentleman's talking. He goes, "You're not from around here, or you don't appear to be from around here." I said, "No, from Boston." And I asked him what he goes. Well, that was a Quaker service, Quaker meeting service, and I'd never seen a Quaker. I'd never seen a Quaker in my life, not up in Boston. So he told me the printing shop that I was looking for, Duffield, not Duffield. Okay, the name escapes me for the moment. It was almost 300 years ago. I'm 316 years old, so you got to give me some, give me a break here.
Dr. Franklin, we totally understand. Yes.
So I'm walking down Market Street in the direction he points me, and there's a young lady sweeping her stoop in front of her house. So I stop, I bow, I smile, I say hello. She looks at me, laughs at me, and turns her back on me.
Huh.
So I just keep on going. I was going to ask her directions. I just keep on going. Later, I found out that she wrote in her diary, "I met a scruffy young lad today. They made the most awkward and ridiculous of appearances." She was talking about me, of course.
Yes.
And I found this out because I got her back good. I married her. 6 years later, I married her.
Wow.
And she shared her diary excerpt with me.
And so did it take 6 years for her to warm up to you, Dr. Franklin, or?
She was a wise woman.
So you wore her down, Dr. Franklin.
Well, I didn't pursue her the entire 6 years. Okay. Two of the years a year and a half, I went to London. But when I came back from London, I really poured the charm on, and she was putty in my head.
Well, Dr. Franklin, how many children did you have with? And this is Deborah you're referring to. Am I correct?
Well, the first child is with a woman that's not been disclosed the history.
Okay.
It was a indiscretion of youth. What I called it, the hard to govern passion of youth.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my first son.
Okay.
William. So 6 months after William was born, I married Deborah, and Deborah took William in as her son. Then came Frankie. Well, Francis. We called him Frankie.
Uh-huh.
His name was Francis Folger Franklin.
Mm-hmm.
And I laid the moniker on him, laid the name of Frankie on him, so he is Frankie Folger Franklin. Unfortunately, Francis died at the age of 4 of smallpox. 2 years after Francis passed, my wife gave birth to Sally. Well, Sarah, I called her Sally, and they were my 3 children. The second, third ones to my wife Deborah.
Okay. So, and we're going to continue on, Dr. Franklin, as our time is running. So one last question, Dr. Franklin, before we move on. Dr. Franklin, would you be an Eagles fan?
Today, currently, absolutely.
Okay, so
and a hockey fan as well.
Okay, Dr. Franklin, I'm not going to bring up hockey, Dr. Franklin. So, listeners, we want to thank Dr. Franklin for sharing with us. We're going to continue our next program, and Dr. Franklin is portrayed, or Rob Carroll portrays Dr. Franklin. Rob, is there any way that our listeners could do you have a website, or how could they get in contact with you if they want to hear more about what you do or even your musical career?
Well, I do. I'm actually doing a Skype and Zoom one-on-ones or small conferences as Ben Franklin. A good way to reach me is Z. My email address is ZOOTPRO. It spells out Zoot Pro, numerical 06 at gmail.com.
And they would be able to contact you or see where you're going to be as Dr. Franklin, or even your music.
Well, yeah. Also, I do my music advertising through Facebook. Rob Carroll on Facebook.
Okay, so listeners, you'll be able to contact Rob through Facebook or the website to see either. So, Rob, we're going to continue in our next program. So, thank you for sharing this with us, and thank you for continuing to have Dr. Franklin alive in our lives to teach Americans about this great founding father.
Well, it was a pleasure joining you, and it's a privilege to carry on Dr. Franklin.
Thank you very much. So, listeners, continue to listen, please. This is WFYL 1180 AM, working for your liberty.
The Spender Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory are proud sponsors of Our American Heritage.
When you experience the loss of a loved one, you can trust the Spender Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory to guide you through the arrangements necessary to create a meaningful ceremony that celebrates the unique life being honored. Our staff is committed to providing your family with the highest quality of care and service in your time of need. We take pride in our responsibility to lighten your burden as you take the first step towards healing. Ask us about how we create a unique service for your loved one. Spender Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory also helps with planning ahead so all the details of the service are taken care of. Ask us how we can connect you with grief support networks in your area. Spender Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory has the resources to compassionately guide you through the loss of your loved one.
Contact us at 610-272-1941. That's 610-272-1941. Or visit our website at myersfh.com. That's MEYERSFH.com.
Good morning and welcome to Our American Heritage. I am Arch Hunter, the host of the program. The American Heritage is a program where we explore in depth the American experience from its beginning to the present. And again, today we want to welcome back as our very special guest, Rob Carroll. Rob, thank you for coming and continuing to share with us.
A pleasure to be here once again, Arch.
We in our first program, Rob explained to our listeners that he portrays Dr. Franklin, and he does that a tremendously well, and he does it a lot. And we were asking Dr. Franklin some questions. So, Rob, if you would like to continue as Dr. Franklin, I have a lot more questions for you if you're so amenable to do that.
Absolutely.
So, Dr. Franklin, you were talking to us when you came to Philadelphia, how you met your wife and your first job. I'm curious, why did you pick printing as your occupation when you came to Philadelphia?
Well, I just spent 6.5 years apprenticing as a printer with my brother James. So it was a craft that I was very well read. Part of my conflict with my brother James is, now you might not believe this, but as a 16 and 17-year-old, I believed that I was smarter than my brother James, and he was 9 years older than me. And I'm sure in your history as an educator, you've never run into precocious 16 to 17-year-olds.
Oh, heavens, no. I have no idea what you're even talking about, Dr. Franklin.
So I became convinced that I was smarter, although there were people that did agree with me. I believe that I technically was the art and the mechanics of printing. I was a better printer than my brother James, and I believed I was a better writer than my brother James. And this led to more conflicts between the two of us. And then with the disclosure that I was writing the Silence Do-Goods and our altercation, that really led me to believe that the Boston wasn't big enough for the two of us. The only down part was that the only trouble was that when I left home, I was breaking my contract, and I was a fugitive from the law.
Oh,
my brother could have very well put advertisements up and down the East Coast. Runaway apprentice brought me back. I would have definitely gotten a whipping, and I would have had to start my apprenticeship over from the beginning. But my father interceded. I've never known the details of what he did, but he was convincing enough and did whatever he needed to do that James did not pursue me and he let me go.
And when you got into the printing business in Philadelphia, Dr. Franklin, tell the listeners how that expanded and how many things that you were doing in Philadelphia, beginning with printing, how you had a great influence on Philadelphia, and then ultimately throughout all the colonies.
I was lucky. I was chasing a job opportunity that I heard of in Philadelphia. By the time I got to Philadelphia, that job opportunity was gone. But the neighboring printer, there were only 2 printers in Philadelphia at the time. Philadelphia there were maybe 15,000 people at the time of my arrival in 1723. at the top, 15,000 people. Even though it was the largest English-speaking city in the Western Hemisphere. I got a job my very first day there, and I worked with this gentleman at Keimer for a year. I had a quick foray. I went to London for a year and a half. I came back and actually when I came back, I wasn't going to be a printer. I met a gentleman, a merchant, Mr. Denham, on the way back from England, and he was paying for my passage back, and I was going to work off that passage as his clerk. And eventually I was going to he had no sons, and I was going to take over his business. Unfortunately, he became sick on the voyage back and never recovered back in Philadelphia. His shop was closed, and I needed to print again. So I got a job, and in this job, another gentleman working there, Mr. Meredith, 2 of us concocted a plan. His father was a farmer and had some money saved. And his father thought I was a good influence on Mr. Meredith. So we borrowed money from Mr. Meredith to start our own printing shop. It took me about a year before I was able to buy him out because he was not a very good partner. He was lazy. So I bought him out, and let's see, by 1730, I was running my own printing shop. 1728, as a matter of fact, I was running my own printing shop, and I proved to be a very hard worker, and I just outworked everybody else. I was also, as I said, very good writer, very good printer. I started what was only the second newspaper ever in Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Gazette. Although, in my wisdom, when I started the newspaper, I started in German because there was a larger German-speaking population in Philadelphia. I got through three issues and none of it sold. So I switched to the Pennsylvania Gazette, and it became a very popular. And what helped me was eventually I became the postmaster for Philadelphia, and the postmaster could determine what went through the mail and what didn't. So all of a sudden, the other newspapers in Philadelphia weren't getting the same access to circulation as mine was. This was completely ethical at the time. Trust me. I was elected clerk of the Pennsylvania Assembly. The clerk decided who was going to get all the printing contracts for the Pennsylvania Assembly, and it's no surprise Ben Franklin's printing shop received all the contracts for printing for the Pennsylvania Assembly. Once again, ethical at the time. I started what I guess my greatest claim to fame as a printer, and what really elevated my wealth, my status, was I started an almanac. I was a very big fan of Titan Leeds Almanac growing up as a boy. And I decided I was going to do something different with my almanac. I was going to go back to my foray in fiction when I wrote about Simon Stewgood. And I was going to create a character. I was going to tell stories in this almanac. And as a matter of fact, the main character was going to be the author, quote unquote, of the almanac, Richard Saunders. Now, Richard Saunders, one thing we do in the almanac, Richard was married to Bridget. And in the almanac, we would predict the weather for the year. And at the time, how we predicted weather was to study stars, study the heavens. And the only time you can study the heavens are at night. So that means that Mr. Saunders is up all night, every night, and sleeping during the day, which is not going over well with Mrs. Saunders.
I can imagine, Dr. Franklin.
And there's always some sort of domestic dispute going on between the two of them. And as most arguments as most domestic arguments, the argument is never actually about what the argument is about. And that was so true. So it would be something else. And you get to the end of and this was published once a year. And you get to the end of the almanac to see how Richard resolved this conflict. And I wouldn't tell you. You had to buy next year's edition to find out. So I guess I'm the inventor of the cliffhanger. So right there, I had a built-in subscription base for the next year. By the third year, I decided that I was going to take subscription, and I wasn't going to start printing until I hit my target subscription. So I never printed one extra copy. They were all subscribed to and paid for before I ever started printing. Another novel usage at the time. And the other thing was that Richard loved to give advice. Could never follow his own, but he loved to give advice, which is most people that give advice. He would say, never trust an old barber or a young doctor. 3 could keep a secret if 2 are dead. Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that served me very well for a long number of years was keep your eyes wide open before marriage and half shut afterwards. And of course, the classic hit, 1 pence saved is 2 pence cleared, or as it's been paraphrased, a penny saved is a penny earned. Mm. So we would put these maxims in the book. We'd give the typical home medicinal remedies, when the sun's going to go up, sun's going to go down, the weather, when to plant different crops, different herbs. So it was a well-rounded, sort of like an early farmer's almanac. And we did very well. I published that book for 23 years. Eventually, it was published something like 10 different languages. The only book that was more popular in the colonies was the Bible. So it provided me with a great source of wealth and a great level of fame and status.
And Dr. Franklin, I don't believe that a lot of people fully understand, because of your wonderful career and so many things you did, that you were a very successful business person.
Well, you know what? As much as anything, my wife was a very successful businesswoman. My wife kept my books for me. She was very frugal. I think if I had my way, I would have not been as frugal as her. She was the credit. She was, but yes, I always watched I did try to watch my finances. I try to make good business decisions, but my wife never gets enough credit in my success.
Mm-hmm. That's very kind of you to say that about your wife. And you're also known, Dr. Franklin, to be an inventor. What motivated you, or what sparked your interest in becoming an inventor? And could you share some of your inventions with our listeners?
Necessity. That's what always sparked my interest. My first invention, I was 13 years old. I was very fond of swimming, which not a lot of people were at the time. A lot of people, your first swimming lesson was when the ship was sinking from underneath of you.
A little late sometime.
And it was definitely a pass-fail class. So I was known as being the best swimmer in Boston, and a new boy had arrived, and I was challenged to a race. Well, I challenged him. I'm not quite sure at this point, but we raced and he beat me, and I was embarrassed. So I went back out and I practiced all day. I raced him the next day, and he beat me again. He beat me a number of times, and I had to figure a solution to this problem. And I saw a duck land on the pond, and then just move so rapidly across the pond. And you realize it's because he has webbed feet. And I thought I just needed webbed feet. So what I did was I made a pair of paddles for my feet and a pair of web paddles for my hands. I was submerged in the water the next day, and I easily beat the young man in the race that day. And then, of course, I shared what I used, and he used them, and everybody used them. And that's the creation of the swim flipper.
Wow.
And because of it, I'm enshrined in Fort Lauderdale at the Swimming Hall of Fame.
Interesting, Dr. Franklin.
I'm the only founding father that is in a Sports Hall of Fame.
So what are some of your other inventions? I mean, that's amazing that you did that when you were 13. What are some of your other inventions that you invented when you came to Philadelphia?
Well, at one point in my domestic situation, I was always tinkering with things. Matter of fact, somebody called me a great scientist. In my 50s, I was in my late 50s, early 60s, I was in London for a long period of time, and I was a member of the Royal Scientific Society. And someone called me a great scientist, and I said, no. Galileo, and all these other individuals, great scientists. I'm a grand tinkerer, because I will look at something and figure out a better way to do it, or I'll look at a problem and I'll come up with a solution for the problem. But I said I never had a creative thought in a day in my life. So I noticed that I was repairing my wife's butter churn and looking at it. My wife's rocking the chair, and I noticed there's a similar motion. So what I did was I attached a butter churn to the back of her rocking chair. So she's sitting there doing her sewing at night in front of the fire and was churning her butter for the next day.
Huh.
I invented a chair that the seat unfolded into a step stool, which allowed me to retrieve books from my bookshelves. I took a long pole, added some string to it, and created a kind of a clamp to retrieve books from the very top of my bookshelves. I added a pedal to the bottom of my chair and a fan above my head, so that I could fan myself while sitting there reading by using my feet.
Uh-huh.
Just a number of different inventions, and all of that was before I retired. I really took off when I was 42. I retired from printing, and that's really when I took off with. I had time to just devote to philosophy and science.
You retired, Dr. Franklin, from printing because you were so successful at 42.
Exactly.
That's it's amazing that you were able to do that.
I ran my own business for just about 20 years.
Share with our listeners what, Dr. Franklin, you were thinking when you took that kite and that key out in that storm.
I was trying to solve a problem. The problem was destruction of property by lightning. We had started the first volunteer fire company in the colonies in Philadelphia to combat this scourge. We started a fire insurance company to help people rebuild after being struck by lightning. But none of these attacked the initial issue. But at the very same time, I was doing experiments with this newfangled discovery of electricity.
Yeah.
And I was very, and electricity at the time was kind of like a parlor trick. It was a shock. It was such low level of electricity. And they'd found that they could create this spark usually using wool against glass, repeatedly rubbing the wool against the glass, and you can create a charge inside the glass, and then you release the charge. One of my favorite stories involves King Louis, where his court magician, which was the scientist, had lined up 100 soldiers and had them clasp hands. And in front of King Louis, what he did was he sent this, without the soldiers knowing, he sent the shock into the first soldier, and it traveled to every one of the soldiers. And when they felt it, they kind of like jumped. And King Louis clapped, laughed, thought this was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. And they get done, and he said something to the effect of, again. And I don't know how many times those poor soldiers had to be shocked for the enjoyment, for the pleasure of King Louis. But it was a parlor trick. When I first saw it, I was in London, and a gentleman had what they called a Leyden jar. A Leyden jar was glass with iron ore filaments, copper tubing, and you could collect a static charge in there and then release it. And he had two standing next to each other with kind of like electrodes come up the top, and the charge would conduct an arc from one electrode to the other. And I thought that was fascinating. So I bought his equipment and brought it back with me, and I started doing experiments in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And what I did was I took 24 of these jars and put them in a wooden box and wired them together, created a spark in each one, and my plan was to release it all at one time. And we were going to do the experiment. We were having a picnic down on the Schuylkill River, and we were going to kill a goose to cook. And we were going to kill the goose by using the electric shock, electric spark. I, unfortunately, in unloading the machine, at one point, I had touched both the positive and the negative at the same time, and I knocked myself out. So in any case, getting back to your dad, I had come to the conclusion in watching weather and doing these experiments, I can come to the conclusion that lightning was composed of electricity, but I just needed to figure a way to prove my theory. So I'd come up with the idea that we were close to completing the steeple at Christ Church, and I was on the committee to raise the funds for this. I thought if we could put a gentleman up in top holding a piece of brass, that when the electric spark hit the brass, he could report down to me. You see the flaw in this experiment.
Yes.
So fortunately for this gentleman, I had the experience with the battery, and I thought this won't be a good idea. So I came up with another idea. Now it wasn't exactly a lightning storm. There were clouds in the sky. you could definitely, it was before the storm, but there was static in the air. So what I did was I borrowed a friend's barn a couple blocks north of my house, and my son William and I took the kite up, and my son William was holding the kite, and I was to get the kite, tie the key to the kite, and bring the kite aloft. Now you might think that I was in danger during this experiment, and I was not, for two very good reasons. The first being, I've already mentioned that William was holding the kite, so I was safe. Now, before you get the wrong idea of me as a father, he was holding a piece of silk and was inside of dry inside of a barn, and electricity won't conduct through a dry piece of silk. But I was outside, and we got the kite up, and the hairs on the string started sticking out, and I knew that the static spark was there. So I brought my knuckle up near the key. The kite wasn't very high. Brought my knuckle up near the key, and electricity arced. I got a shock from the key.
Yeah.
And I proved my theory that lightning was caused by electricity. So now, how does this work for us? Well, I came to believe that there were positive and negative charges in the sky and on the ground, and they were just trying to meet, just like those two Leyden jars trying to meet. So if we came up with a safe way to allow passage into the ground, we could save the structures from the bolt of electricity.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the lightning rod came from.
Wow, that's fascinating, Dr. Franklin. If you don't mind, sir, let me change gears a little bit.
Sure.
Because future America really struggled, and unfortunately we had a major war over this issue. Could you share with our listeners your thinking on slavery?
Well, I was a slave owner for for half of my adult life. I was a slave owner. I had the most slaves I had at one time were 3. I actually took one with me on one of my trips to London. But when I came to a couple things changed my thinking, and it changed. A lot of it happened on a trip to Ireland one summer when I was in England, and the two things that changed were my ideas of who we were in the English eyes. I see how they treated the Irish, and that led me to think about how we treated enslaved Africans in our country. And I really I had to do through soul searching. I realized that we would never be treated as English, and that we needed to repudiate slavery. And in 1776, when I got back from England, I served for a very short time as president of the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. And a lot of people thought it was important that I, even for a short time, because I was going to be off for France in a very short period of time, but the symbol of me being the president with my fame, my status, and previously being a slave owner, repudiating it, that the symbol of that was a very powerful symbol.
Yes.
And I've always been proud. My two favorite philosophers of all time were Jesus and Socrates. I read both of them in great detail. And one thing I took from Socrates is that an unexamined life is not worth living. So I did spend my entire life trying to improve myself, whether it was through education or morally, however it be. Just continue to reevaluate my life.
And Dr. Franklin, in doing that, and you told us that you read a tremendous amount. Did you not also start the free public library in Philadelphia so other people could experience and have education?
Oh, absolutely, without doubt. But it wasn't just me. It came about from the junta. The junta were anywhere between 4 and 6 individuals at a time. Today, the junta is the American Philosophical Society. But the junta, we'd meet once a month, and it was a way of meeting and improving ourselves. Once a month, somebody had to write a paper on some topic. If somebody came into town and we thought they were deserving of help, we'd take them under our wing. And another thing what came out was Pennsylvania Hospital, the volunteer fire company, and the free library. I'll tell you that on my last will and testament, I've written, I, Ben Franklin, printer. I never mentioned in my last will and testament, I never mentioned a kite, a key, a declaration, or a constitution. I thought the most important thing I'd ever done in life was print, because I'm self-educated, and that knowledge is power, and you derive knowledge primarily from sources on your own, and the person responsible for those sources even existing are printers. So I thought that was the greatest work I'd ever done in my life. And along with that knowledge of power, I was very fortunate to grow up where I did, when I did, because I had access to to material that I would, if I was in England, I would never had access to. It's because of the society I grew up in. And my father wasn't a wealthy man, but he wasn't a poor man. And I had the benefit of an apprenticeship. But what I came to believe is that everyone needed access to that information. University of Pennsylvania started as the Pennsylvania Academy, and the Pennsylvania Academy was started for the sons of the working class, to provide a higher education to the sons of the working class. I believe the university's changed a bit over the years, but although the university does have a great deal of dedication to the common man in Philadelphia.
That Dr. Franklin, you are beyond fascinating, and there are so many more questions that I would like to ask you. Would you be willing to ever come back and answer more of our questions to share your fascinating life with our listeners?
Without a doubt.
Thank you so much. So, Dr. Franklin, thank you for coming and sharing with us. And Dr. Franklin, we want to introduce a very good friend of yours and a friend of mine. His name is Rob Carroll. So would Rob share with our listeners where our listeners could either contact you or get in touch with you to continue Dr. Franklin or Rob, your fascinating music career?
Well, I'm a professional musician, and I'm also the sole agent for Dr. Franklin in the Philadelphia area. You can get either one of us. You can get Rob Carroll Facebook, where you go to Facebook and you see a picture of a gentleman with long hair singing or playing saxophone, and you can reach. And also there's a photo of Dr. Franklin on my Facebook page. Or you can contact us at ZOOTPRO. That spells ZootPro06@gmail.com.
And they would be able to see where you're playing and get more information. Correct, Rob?
Absolutely.
So, listener, Rob, thank you so much for coming and sharing your passions and your passion for Benjamin Franklin and for your willingness to study his life, to share this great founding father. So, Rob, we want to thank you for coming and sharing with us today.
Well, it was a pleasure being there, and it's a privilege to carry on the story of Dr. Franklin.
Thank you so much, Rob, for coming. This is WFYL 1180 AM, working for your liberty.